So while Fanon does not use the term biocitizenship or biological citizenship, his work is definitely important in theorizing and thinking about the relationship between the body and the state. Which types of bodies were prioritized by the state? How did the subjects, colonial subjects, interpret that and relate to the state and relate their own illnesses to the colonial project? And that surely has implications for the colonial and post-colonial eras. It clearly, during the colonial era, it produces distrust, and there's a number of anthropological studies in the post-colonial space that argue that distrust of state public health interventions, because of their involvement in the colonial health project, has carried over into the post-colonial space. One example, I don't have the answer to this, but a question to ask is to what extent, for instance, vaccine hesitancy might be linked to historical memories around state interventions. But one thing missing in both Foucault and Fanon's treatment of this is the issue of the gendered body and how gender was part of the colonial project and shaped the relationships between the body and the state. So there's a lot of feminist literature on this, but the one writer who I'll speak to today is the South African feminist Phumla Qola, who writes in a book on rape in South Africa about specifically these histories of colonialism, race, and sexual violence. And the point Qola makes is that rape and sexual violence were not like a side effect of the colonial project. They were always central to the colonial project. And to understand state power, we need to understand that sexual violence has been central to how state power is wielded, and even in the post-colonial era remains central to how social power is structured. And I think this is a very powerful way of thinking about the relationship to the state and the body. Not only the state, but to power more broadly. So Qola writes, the idea of race as a way of seeing, defining, experiencing, and ordering the world is a fairly recent one in human history, and it draws extensively on the creation of race, the creation of sexual difference and violence. Race as an idea becomes first a form of knowledge and ordering system, which is then institutionalized, thus gaining legitimacy through the extensive use of sexual violence. The history of race is the history of slavery, colonialism, and race science. And Qola outlines in her book the way in which on slave plantations in the Cape it was not illegal to rape female slaves. And so rape was very much part of slavery, and this took place all over the world. I'm actually speaking from Brazil, and here you had a very similar dynamic. And so the imposition of the colonial project, in which rape and sexual violence form part of this. She writes, with race, shame is produced through slavery, colonialism, and the context that comes through these. So it wasn't just the physical effect, it was also the humiliation, the shaming of certain types of bodies. And the rape of slaves was an integral part of the architecture of slave-ordered Cape society. Again, Qola is not writing specifically about biological and citizenship, but her work is really important because I don't think one can think of the relationship to the body and the state in terms of biocitizenship without thinking about the histories of the relationship to the body and the state, the way these are racialized and the way these are gendered, and in many ways the ways they continue to be so. So now with that background, I'm going to move on to the more formal concept of biocitizenship or biological citizenship. So the concept was actually developed, and I guess it's timely now to go back to this text, but it was developed in relationship to Ukraine, and particularly the Chernobyl disaster by the anthropologist Adriana Petrina. So Petrina was writing about the continuing impacts of the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, which took place in the former Soviet Union and what is now Ukraine. And it's the most well-known nuclear disaster in history. So the nuclear disaster led to over 4,000 cases of thyroid cancer as a result of exposure to radiation, over 350,000 people displaced, and according to the WHO in 2005, 2 decades after the Chernobyl accident, residents in the affected areas still lack the information they need to lead healthy and productive lives that are possible. So, of course, in the present moment, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the recent shelling of a nuclear power station, which almost led to another nuclear disaster, this has a particular resonance with the present crisis. But one might ask, well, what is the connection between this and thinking about biocitizenship in Africa? Well, the connection is, as I outline, is that Petrina conceptualizes a particular relationship between bodies, and particularly injured or ill bodies, and the state, which comes out of this. And this conceptualization can be adapted to different locations. So Petrina writes in her 2002 book Life Exposed that biological citizenship describes a state where in Ukraine, where an emergent democracy is yoked to a harsh market transition, the damaged biology of a population has become the grounds for social membership and the basis for staking citizenship claims. In the later article, which I'll share, she writes, biological citizenship is a demand for but limited access to a form of social welfare based on medical, scientific, and legal criteria that recognize injury and compensate for it. These demands are being expressed in the context of losses of primary resources such as employment and state protections against inflation and a deterioration in legal and political categories. So in essence, and I can't go into this in too much detail, but the fact of being exposed and potentially made ill by Chernobyl gave access to those populations to a particular set of rights, grants, payments, and so on. And the category of being, in essence, a victim of Chernobyl became a way to leverage resources from the state, and particularly at the time in 1991, Ukraine declared independence from the Soviet Union. The whole region of the former Soviet Union was undergoing a transition from, state communism to socialism, to capitalism, and the new market order also produced all forms of inequality. And so, within the context of this, of the formation of a democratic state, the body became a means to accessing resources. And so the key point here is that illness then becomes a particular way of making a claim on the state. And this is what Petrina means by biocitizenship, biological citizenship. So, for instance, she writes, in the political economy of Chernobyl-related illnesses, it was common knowledge that a person categorized as disabled was far better compensated than a mere sufferer. Persons completely outside the system of Chernobyl sufferers knew they had little chance of getting decent social protections from the state. Petrina also introduces the term of biosociality and writes, the linkage between biology and identity is not new. What is new is how connections between biology and identity are being made. In contrast with older and discredited biologized categories such as race or ethnicity, these new biological identities and the interest groups formed in their name now have the potential to drive political economies and forms of commerce. So the key point here again, and if you think back, I mean, Petrina is very influenced by Foucault's conception of biopower. She's not saying, oh, it's bad that, sufferers of Chernobyl have access to resources. She's outlining that, well, this produces a new dynamic, a new way in which claims of the states are made, but also new forms of inequality. For instance, if one is a Chernobyl survivor, one has access to certain resources that one doesn't have if one has another form of illness, for instance. There's also a kind of hierarchy between sufferers, for instance, between forms of disability and those who aren't disabled. And so in this analysis of biocitizenship and looking at how claims are made, we need to be sensitive to these varying dynamics. So I'm going to move on then to a different conception of biological citizenship that both draws on Petrina but also adapts it to a different context.